I'm placing the horizon line just above halfway because the main focus of this painting really is in the foreground. It's the reflection, and then the seagulls, they will attract most of the attention. I'm roughly dividing it in thirds on the horizontal axis, and that's where I'm going to place that biggest rock on that outcrop of the headland. I've pulled the far distant headland further into the picture, so that's almost halfway across the page, just so that we have a little bit more overlap and don't have too much of an empty space there next to the headland. And then I draw in the angle of the foreground rocks, so they're coming sort of towards us a little bit. And then the cliff, that is our strongest vertical. And it's important that we have an interesting edge of that cliff, so there's outcrops of the little rocks. And then I'm looking at where the waterline starts at the rocks and then draw that across. And then I also sketch in roughly the reflection, because that's easy to get wrong later on. Actually, I'm putting the waterline a little bit higher. I don't want to have too much of an ocean. The focus on this painting isn't the ocean. That's sort of just a supporting actor here. It's about the reflection, the light and dark. Then I'm going to mark out the cloud reflection as well, knowing where that starts and stops, and mirror that above. And then also making sure that my cliff reflection lines up vertically with the edges. A few marks there so I know what's rock and what is some greenery. Now put the seagulls in mostly to balance out the composition. While it works fine on the photo, I felt that it missed something when I painted it the first time around without seagulls. So that's why we're adding those in. And as you could see, the first one sits also on the 1/3 line in from the left to stick with the rule of thirds composition. And then it's always a good idea to work in groups of 3s and just make sure that they're not evenly spaced. Our first layer is going to cover the sky and the beach, and I'm starting with wetting those two areas. So I leave the ocean dry. That doesn't need any water or paint in this first layer, so I'm just going to wet everything else, the sky, the cliffs, and the beach. And we're going to just cover that with a light wash and drop in the wet in wet clouds. This is a softer sky than the last one and the one before. So we're just going to create some soft clouds on an overcast day. And I'm just going to dry out the seagulls because I might want to have a little bit of white on them. So just with a tissue, just dabble out the water there on top of the seagulls. I start with some cobalt. You could use cerulean blue. It's also a nice sky color. I like cobalt because it's transparent and it's got a nice, lovely warm feel. And I'm using a soft flat brush here, but again, use whatever works for you. I'd suggest a big brush, so you have bigger marks. And as you can see, I'm straight away mirroring what I'm putting in above into the beach. So the clouds are being reflected on the wet sand. And I'm adding a little bit of lavender in. That slows down the movement of my pigment because we've added in the water. So you've got to be a little bit careful about how much water we're adding to it with our mixes. So lavender is a good way to get these nice soft skies. Got a bit of a creamy feel to it. I've also put in a tiny bit of magenta, and I'm just going to prop up my board so that the light has a bit less reflection so you can see what I'm doing. So moving into sort of a purpley lilac, and then added in a bit of more indigo. I just want some soft variations in those clouds. And that's why we started with a wet paper. That just helps us get these nice soft skies, these soft clouds. It's just that ceiling of clouds that's hanging over the horizon. Doesn't need a whole lot. I'm switching to a smaller brush because I want to have some very faint clouds just above the horizon line. And you can't go wrong with this sky, so whatever happens on your paper happens on your paper. I would suggest to keep it quite light though, because we want to have a value change in the sand where the sky is reflected in that strip where the seagulls are standing versus the wet sand below it. So we want to create that difference in light. And for a bit more interest, I am dropping in some slightly darker clouds towards the top, but you can see it's very subtle, nothing like we did last week. And my horizon line is already drying out, so that's why I'm spraying it just a tiny bit, just to keep the pigment alive, while I'm still deciding if it needs more work or not. I do like that I've got a little bit of white peeking through there, so I want to preserve that. And now I'm going to mirror that ever so slightly in the bottom. Just a few brush strokes into that wet sand area. And then we're moving on to the wet sand just below it. And for that, I'm going to mix my wet sand color, which is a lavender and a little bit of raw sienna. And we're going to drop in some more colors in a minute, but that's where we start. It's really just a soft gray that contrasts in temperature to the cool reflection of the clouds and the sky. And even though we're going to darken this in our second layer, I want to achieve as much as I can in my first wash. So I'm going to build up a bit more tone and create some variation into this sand area, especially towards the bottom left corner. So I'm going to mix a slightly darker version of this, dropped in a bit of burnt sienna, a tiny bit of magenta, just to give it a bit of a purple touch to it. And then I'm also going to put a little bit of that color just under the waterline where the water hits the sand. But we're not quite done yet, so I'm going to mix an even darker version of this with a bit more red in it, pushing it almost into a very soft purple to get that variation in the wet sand. They can get quite dark. This painting is all about reflections in the water, so I'm actually going to lift out a little bit of that lighter color just to have the white cloud above being reflected in that sand. And I think later on I'm going to cover it again. So this is just a working stage of a painting where, I add things, I remove things. But in this moment I felt I needed to lift out a little bit and then darken some of that wet sand around it. So I'm going to go even a little bit darker with my purpley brown here. And then also create more interesting edges between the reflection of the sky into the sand, just there below those seagulls, and a few more brush marks around it, so that we have this transition from light to dark as we go from the right side to the left side. And here I'm just pointing out that my water has pooled because I had it obviously on a slight angle. So over time, while I was working on the beach, some of that water has pooled just above that dry bit of paper there where the white cloud is. So now I'm just going to tip that back in. It isn't too late to move it back up. If the mix just above it has dried too much and you do this, then you will create blooms. So again, it's a bit tricky to judge that, but my sky is wet enough for me to be able to push that back. And then I'm also pointing out that it's a bit too white around the seagulls. So if I wanted to have the white of the seagulls stand out, I need to make sure that just around the seagulls is a bit of pigment. So I'm just filling up those gaps. And that area is also still moist enough for me to do that without introducing any blooms. Right. And you can see there's still quite a bit of shine on this paper, so when you wet the paper at the beginning with clear water, you have a lot more time to work on your paintings. And you can do things like lifting out some more clouds. I just wanted to fix that edge there of that white cloud that had a bit of a harsh ending. So clean brush, take the water out, and then we can feather out some edges. And that's our first layer done. In this next layer, we're going to take care of the ocean and the distant headland as well as the cliff before we then move on to the reflections and the foreground. For the distant headland, I'll start with a very similar wash to what we've already had. It's going to be a light bluish purple. That gives us that a nice aerial perspective. And it can be, quite light. Just want to make sure we have a bit of contrast between the headland and that rock that's sitting in front of it. But I start light. I can always go darker if I have to. So just carefully paint around that one rock that sits there. And then I do decide it needs a bit more pigment, and I'm going to go to a smaller brush. I just add a bit more of my cobalt blue into this same mix. Maybe even a touch of indigo, and then just drop that into that wet first layer. This will also help with creating just a ever so slight texture. It makes it look like there's trees growing there in the distance. It looks a bit too dark at the moment, but as always, watercolor dries a lot lighter. And as we talked about last time, make sure that we have a nice ending to the headland. Now, I'm not going to wait for this to dry before I start my ocean, because I'm going to leave just a slither of white underneath that headland. So my ocean isn't going to touch the wet headland. That's going to be a bit of a breaking wave underneath it. From a value perspective, the ocean is a mid-value, probably on the lighter side of a mid-value. It's got to be darker than the headland, but not quite as dark as the cliff. And we're starting with a straight horizon line, or as straight as possible. But that's why a straight pencil line really helps. And there it is. I'm painting just a couple of millimeters below it. And it wouldn't be the worst if that ran into your headland, but it's nice to leave a little bit of a white strip there. And by now we know how to paint breaking waves. The reason I have some more white waves on the left side of the painting is for the same reason we're putting in the seagulls. It's to balance out our painting a bit more. It creates more interest on the left edge of the painting, which will lead us into the painting. So that's why I've started off with my ocean being like a triangular shape and creating the movement of the waves, or the angle of the waves. So I've changed my color ever so slightly. I pushed it a little bit into a green, so I've added a hint of yellow into it, or raw sienna. And then I'm going to paint the underside of the wave, just leaving the top of it white and making it broader, bigger as I move to the left side of the painting. And then take care when it meets the rocks there on the right side to also give that impression of the water breaking and some sea foam around the rocks. Now I'm going to take out a bit of pigment and a bit of water because I want to just dry brush that last bit in as we've done in previous paintings, just to create that foamy texture. And then I stand back and have a quick look at it and then see what else it needs. Just a few more lines here and there. Break up that wave, and then I add some darker pigment. Hardly any water in it, because obviously that paper is wet. And then just drop a tiny bit of dark pigment directly under the white crests, and that will give us these nice shadows. For the cliff, I'm going to mix 3 different colors to work with. When I cover a big shape like this, I want to make sure that I have lots of variation in the colors and also some value shifts. Now, as you can see from the final image, we're keeping this quite a warm brownish color, this cliff. So I'm just going to mix a lighter and a darker brown, and then a color for the shadow, which is raw sienna mostly for the lighter color, and then burnt sienna darkened with a bit of ultramarine blue or indigo. That's up to you. And then I've got also a bit of red in there. And as I move from the top to the bottom, I just switch my colors every now and again. So I'm just going to dip into my darker blue color, and I look back at the reference photo more as a guide, not to necessarily copy it, but it's a bit darker there on the edges on the left side of that cliff. We're going to add the shadows in later, but this wash should be a solid mid-tone. There has to be a strong enough contrast now against the sky and the distant headland. I started off with a relatively big brush, the one that I've used so far for this painting. But as I'm coming down to the smaller rocks, I need a bit more control, so I'm going to switch to my round brush, a synthetic round brush that's got a good point, so that I can now paint those rocks in a bit more detail. And that one rock that sticks out and overlaps the headland in the distance, I'm going to keep that a bit lighter. So I'm going to paint around it first and then just tone it down a little bit. I definitely want to have a bit of a shift in my colors from the main cliff and the rocks at the base of it. That just helps a little bit with visual separation. So you can see it's quite a colorful assembly there. And then use my darker and cooler color, that one in the bottom there on my palette, to add some shadows, but also to create some grayish rocks. You just choose your colors. It doesn't have to be precisely the same as mine, as long as there's some variation. For the ones that are closest to us, they're what I'm painting right now. I'm going to go back to my lighter color. I warm them up. I make them a bit lighter. All just with the objective to have separations between the different layers of the rocks, the cliff, the rocks at the bottom of the cliff, and then the rock shelf that's closest to us. And then we also have some greenery at the top, and in that area that's white at the moment, so we're going to fill that in as well in a second. First, I'm just going to add a few shadows here and there while it's wet, so that they can fuzz out. Check your edge of the cliff, make sure that that is a nice shape. It's got some raggedness to it, a few things sticking out here and there. And if you like, add a little bit of darker color just at the very base of the rocks for some shadows. Now mixing that green color, quite muted. And then add that to the top. It's a bit too bright, so I'm going to tone it down a little bit with my blue. And here you have to be a little bit deliberate with your brush strokes so that they look like shrubs or small trees on top of a cliff, so that it's not just a solid shape with a straight edge and it's just a blob. It's got to look like vegetation. And I use the same color for that vegetation that's growing on the side of the cliff, or it's actually, I think it's a bush that's kind of coming into the picture, sitting on top of that lighter rock. For the reflection, I'm going to mix a good amount of a mid value in a medium sort of brown, not too red, but not too dark either. Reflections are often darker or lighter than what they are reflecting. In this instance, they're pretty much on par when you look at the photograph. It's very similar value. I would say the cliff is maybe a little bit darker in the photo, but how this one turned out for me, I would think that my reflection is going to be just ever so slightly dark. But yeah, as long as you kind of match the same value, make sure your color is, or your mix is juicy, that you have enough to cover that area. And I'm going to leave a little bit of dry paper between the rock and the reflection. It's a bit of dry sand there, or at least lighter sand. And in case that your cliff hasn't dried yet, that also will obviously avoid the blending. And I'm trying to match the vertical, and if you look carefully, I've actually didn't. My reflection of the cliff is a little bit too far to the left. In an ideal world, I would have made that exactly vertically below it. So I covered this area, and then I quickly dropped in some of the green that I still had left, because we want to match a few of the colors, mirror that from what is above. And then I'm going to refine those edges a little bit. It's a hard edge, that's why we didn't re-wet the beach. This is, it's like a mirror, that surface, so the reflection has hard edges and not soft edges. And then dropping a bit of a redder color to, again, mimic what's above. So look at your cliff and then just see where you can and should drop in a little bit of color to get a bit of variation into that reflection. I also want to lift out that a lighter rock that I've got there, just with a damp and clean brush, just a one brush stroke. And then I'm going to just refine that edge a bit and then use a very fine line of that same color to place that right under that breaking wave there. Now in my painting here, this bottom left corner dried too light for what I had in mind, because one of the things I really like about the photo is that we have this dark cloud reflected, and it has a significant value change to the lighter part of the sky. Even though my top half of the painting, the sky itself, doesn't really have a dark cloud, I'm just going to invent it in the reflection, because I love that value shift in the bottom part of the painting. So if yours is too light as well, now is the time to strengthen that. So I've just sprayed it with a bit of water, just so that I can avoid too much dry brushing there. I just want this to be quite soft, in the sand at least. I like the hard edge between the lighter part and the darker part, what I'm doing right now there. But I just needed to have a little bit more weight in the bottom left corner, so that's when I'm strengthening that. And by doing that, you can almost see how the white clouds right next to it kind of pop out all of a sudden. And then I'm going to clean my brush and take the water out, and then just feather out those edges. Then go all the way to the edge of the painting. Always make sure that you go past your edge of the painting so that you fill the whole area. And I'm just going to refine that edge to the lighter part of the reflection, just ever so slightly, just to create almost a few ripples in there. Okay, crunch time. Time to pop in our seagulls. And I'm going to start with a very light grey and a pretty fine paintbrush. I want a bit of control. And I'm just going to paint the underside, so the shadow side of those birds. Even in cloudy conditions when there is not harsh or direct sunlight, obviously things underneath are always a bit darker because the light sits on top. So I'm just going to leave the top white. That's why we painted around those seagulls carefully, just that there is a bit of a value shift. And in an ideal world, my pencil lines would have also maybe been a little bit lighter because they are going to be visible. But maybe they help define the seagull, so maybe that was for the better after all. So first the bellies, and I'm going to go to an even smaller brush. I've got a really, really fine brush here that I rarely pull out except for the tiny details. So use the finest brush that you have. Otherwise you can use the rigger as well. It's pretty fine. And I'm going to add the black tails. There you go. Tail feathers that tucked under, maybe a little bit darker underneath. We don't need to do much. And then I'm going to mix a dirty red for the legs. I don't usually paint feet of birds, and even humans, figures. Feet are always difficult and they're awkward, and they're best to be hidden with a bit of ground shadow or, grass or something. And then more small stroke for the beak. It's almost like a dot. And again, we're just suggesting it. We don't paint much detail at that size. So now we get to the detailed stage where we're just adding a bit of texture and some shadows, but the hard part is over. These things are easier and hopefully even more fun than what we've done so far. So I'm just mixing a good dark value, not too dark. You don't want to punch holes into it, but it's got to be a good mix, not a lot of water, where we just use a few lines here and there and some dry brushing just to create a few shadows into the cliff, maybe strengthening an area somewhere. Don't overdo it, just a few suggested lines here and there. Those cliffs have got these distinct horizontal lines. Now mixing a bit of a dirty grey and just adding a few more shadows underneath those rocks there at the base of the cliff, just to strengthen the contrast between that lighter rock and what sits in front of it. This is like, amping up the contrast on a photo. That's what we're trying to do, just to darken the darks a little bit, which will then dial up the overall brightness of everything else. Contrast is a hugely important element in your watercolor paintings. Something I struggled with for quite some time and wondered why my paintings looked lifeless and a bit lackluster, and it's not enough dark colors, not enough contrast, well-placed contrast as well. So don't be afraid to dig into your darker pigments and get some nice contrast, especially for shadows. I'm just going to work on those foreground rocks a little bit, just add a couple of cracks in there and a few shadows, just to break up that big main shape. But I don't want to add too many lines in either. Don't want it to be too bitsy. Then it would attract too much attention. The focus should stay on the seagulls, balancing out that cliff, so the viewer's eye should sort of go between the cliff, back to the seagulls, back and forth. And always take a moment to look at your painting and see what else does it need. My greenery needs a little bit of an undershadow as well, a bit too flat. So if I keep in line with my shadows, like at the bottom of the seagulls, the underbelly, and then, the ones I put in the rocks there, I need to also add a little bit of dark at the base of those two green areas, which will make it look more realistic straight away. So I decided to add an eye to the two bigger seagulls, and that's literally just one dot. And it's better not to put it in than to make it too big, so up to you. And then I'm going to add the reflections underneath the seagulls. So let's just take that brown that's left there in my pigment. Just going to start with the legs. They reflect as well before I reflect the body. And it's just a few brush strokes. Just a few zigzaggy lines into that sand. Don't have to, paint a mirror image of a seagull. Even though in a photo, probably it would look like a proper seagull because it's like a mirror. That's how flat the reflection is. But we use abstraction. We're just hinting at the reflection. Soften that a little bit. That's all we need to create the illusion of the reflection of something in the wet sand. And to further the illusion of the water reflections, I'm going to add a few things lying on the beach. Clumps of seaweed or, I don't know, dead sticks. Doesn't matter. Just a few dots here and there. In variation, in your repetition, make them different sizes, different shapes. Just a few things lying around. And then I pick up a bit more pigment and then just some vertical dry brush strokes downwards for their reflection. It just enhances that, mirror-like quality of that wet sand. Splatters also work well on sand, just like we did in the first of our paintings, just to create a bit of more texture. To add another element of interest and a bit of life into this painting, we're going to paint a few flying seagulls, and they are just a couple of brush strokes. It's fine to kind of paint them like you did in primary school, little V's, but you can vary them a bit with the angles that they fly, or one wing a bit longer than the other one. And then maybe two more at the top. Always good to think in odd numbers. That's just more pleasing. Just like when you make a flower arrangement, better to have 3 or 5 roses than 4. We do the same when we group objects. And then I'm just finishing it off, just a little bit more shadow under those waves. Again, just to strengthen the contrast a little bit where it's needed. But you got to judge for yourself whether that's needed in your painting. And in most paintings, I'm adding a tiny bit of a white paint at the top. This is opaque paint, so titanium white or white gouache works well for this. And here I'm just going to add a bit of a highlight on top of those clumps there on the beach. And when you have reflections, whether that's in the water or here on the sand, and you have a big shape like that, there's another trick in the book, and that's just to break it up with 1 or 2 lines of a white paint. Just hints at a ripple of sorts where the sky is reflected into. And it helps with the illusion that we're looking at a reflection on a surface rather than the reflection being a shape in and of itself. And because I got the white paint out, I'm just going to add a few splatters on that side as well. I just love texture, but you don't have to do that.